We might have lost the battle recently with the Supreme Court case that said that the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association lawsuit was moot. And we might have had a temporary loss with the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals issuing an emergency stay with the ammunition background check lawsuit that was before Judge Benitez. And just because we lost those battles does not mean that we are losing the war. There are currently 10 Supreme Court cases that are up for conference that are going to be considered this Friday, May 1st. And let's talk about a little overview of what all of these cases are, what some of the bigger implications are. So we saw, and I was very critical with Kavanaugh's concurrence of the mootness and him voting alongside with the anti-gun point. And you know, I might have given him too little credit, and I might have been too harsh on his opinion of it, because technically when you look at it, yes, the damages that the plaintiffs were seeking were no longer there because the laws were no longer in effect and the laws were now outlawed in the state of New York, which sucks because it allowed the state to drag their feet and put forth a lot of restrictions and a lot of infringements on our rights to keep and bear arms. For a long period of time, they got to a point where they were about to get their slap on the wrist, and they said, oh wait, no, we didn't mean it. And that sucks. However, it wasn't the biggest battle that we could have won, and it's not necessarily the battle that we want to choose to die on that hill. Let's talk about why. And I first just want to say thank you to everyone that countered me and provided good actual debate and insight on that video, because while I do still feel many of the points I made were valid, I always appreciate hearing well thought out arguments against what I'm saying, because if you're just going to try to come at me and say you're stupid, you're dumb, I'm not going to listen to you. But if you come at me and say, hey, I know that you see this information and that makes you think this, but if you look at this along with it, I do like having those conversations. So if I ever say anything wrong, feel free to have a good conversation and we'll see where it goes. I believe it was a user named Canned Jam who was having a good conversation on there. So Canned Jam, if I'm messing up your name, thank you. I'm gonna give you a quick overview of the 10 cases that the Supreme Court is gonna be looking at and considering for whether or not they choose to grant it review. So the first one, Mance versus Barr, challenges the federal ban on interstate handgun purchases. First established by the Gun Control Act of 1968, this is especially relevant in the District of Columbia, where there is only one FFL with limited availability and monopolistic fees. Now this is actually pretty interesting because recently I heard that in the District of Columbia, during the whole COVID-19 thing, I believe the only FFL was forced to close up shop, but the police in DC actually started acting as an FFL, allowing people to do gun transfers there. That might be wrong, but I do believe I read something about that because they were afraid of this whole issue of not being able to buy guns in their area. So moving on, Pena versus Haran. The Californians that are watching this video are going to be very pleased about this one. It challenges the micro-stamping requirement of the California handgun roster, which is a de facto ban on handguns, common use since they lack technology that doesn't yet exist. Everyone in California knows and is frustrated and really truly hates the California handgun roster because it makes no sense. The California handgun roster exists solely to prevent people from owning handguns and reduce the availability of inexpensive options or even safer options. They want it to make it as hard as possible for people to be able to get guns, so they say you can only buy our approved X, Y, or Z lists. And this really does suck because there's guns that are arguably much safer that are off roster, that are not on the approved for sale safe handgun roster, but we can't buy them, which makes absolutely no sense. I know me personally, if this passes, I am going to be losing a ton of money. I will buy so many handguns that are off roster that it would be ridiculous. So the next one, Rogers versus Grewal. Rogers versus Grewal, the next one, challenges New Jersey's May issue requirement, and we see that also with Massachusetts's May issue concealed carry licenses for Gould and Lipson, as well as Ciolek versus New Jersey. It's another challenge of New Jersey's justifiable need or good cause. There's several that are based on concealed carry permits because in California and in many other states, you have to provide good cause or justifiable good cause or extenuating circumstances to exercise your right to take a firearm out of your home for concealed carry purposes, which is absolutely ridiculous. If you're legal and safe enough to own a gun, if you are a bad person, you're going to go do bad things with that gun anyway. If you're a good person, you're going to then have to make that choice of, do you break the law and potentially ruin your life, or do you keep the gun at home and potentially risk your life not having a gun to defend yourself? So all the May issue states, it's just a ridiculous argument. Cheeseman versus Polillo is another New Jersey May issue scheme. The Warman versus Healy, this is one of the biggest ones. This one is actually the challenge of Massachusetts' ban on owning assault weapons. Currently, Massachusetts has this weird, pre-ban versus post-ban thing. I believe they have guns where you can have the H-bar barrels, but it's basically this whole assault weapon ban. It's just ridiculous. And it's something that, if you look at what's in common use using the argument of Heller, AR-15s and AK-47s assault weapon style firearms are actually incredibly commonly used. I think the most recent number I heard was 17 million AR-15 and AK-47 style firearms are currently in civilian ownership in California, or in the United States, which when you think about 17 million guns, that's only like, what, we have 300 million people in the United States? That's a lot of guns. That's what I would consider common use. So if we can get an assault weapon ban case up to the Supreme Court, in a couple years, there might not be any more assault weapon bans, which would mean in California, we could build all kinds of sweet AR pistols. We can get those cool Uzis. I have wanted a ghetto blaster for years now. And the fact that I can't just go out and buy a MAC-10 kills me inside. And it's just something that I cannot live with myself not being able to own a gun like that. So basically, when you look at these court cases, we have about 10 court cases that are up for discussion, many of them focusing around concealed carry. We have the handgun roster with Pena and Horan, and then we have Warman versus Healy, which is the assault weapon ban. And if we could get any of those up to the Supreme Court, if I had to choose, the selfish part of me says handgun roster because that affects me the most, but I would have to think that the assault weapon ban and concealed carry laws are potentially more important. But if we can get all three of those to the Supreme Court, or if we can get some sort of favorable ruling with any one of those, that would be huge, and that's very important. So from the way that I understand it, it appears as if the Supreme Court has these conferences twice a week if they're in session, once a week if they're not in session and they're not hearing arguments. And this could be, several weeks down the road before we hear whether or not they actually decide on something. But for us to know that there's actually 10 Supreme Court cases that are being brought to them that they are looking at and they're going to be deciding on, this is huge. I can't say that any of these are actually going to be accepted. I can't say that any of these are going to be favorable. Regardless of how it works out, if they do choose to hear it, we're probably looking at least a year and a half, 2 years before we have any sort of real movement on it. But this is huge. We might have lost those small battles along the way, but it appears as if we have a chance to win the war. And it's why right now we need to support organizations that are actually fighting for our rights. I am a big fan of the Firearms Policy Coalition, California Rifle and Pistol Association, Gun Owners of America, and there's many more out there that you may choose to support. The NRA, I don't really choose to give my money to just because I think they haven't done much of worth lately, but the Firearms Policy Coalition has been big, especially in California. If you're a Californian and you have the money and you're not supporting Firearms Policy Coalition, what are you doing? Come on, get with the program. I want to have these conversations. If you guys have any opinions on what you feel would be the biggest, the most important, what you actually want to be heard by them, let's have that conversation. I'd love to have a conversation in the live chat with you when this premieres. I'd love to have that conversation in the actual comment section. So if you have any questions, let's talk about it. If you have anything you want to say, let's talk about it. I enjoy having these conversations with you. Again, I appreciate when people are able to respectfully counter my opinions and provide input that says, hey, here's why I think you're wrong. I see that information in a different way. Let's work with it. And I do enjoy having those conversations. But let's all have a little bit of look on the bright side because we have some potential movement with the Supreme Court, and let's hope this all works out in our favor. As always, have fun, be safe, stay dangerous. Peace.